Imagine you're a track marshal. A driver has just crashed and you go to help him. But this happens to you. The driver greets you with a hit that almost knocks you out when all you wanted to do was help him. It sounds a bit extreme, but as you saw, this happened. And it wasn't an isolated case. There are also the two teammates who were involved in one of the most embarrassing espionage scandals in the history of the sport, which ended with a $100 million fine for the team. Another driver intentionally crashed into his direct rival in the last race of the season to secure his first world title. There was one who was fined $1 million for racist and homophobic comments, and another who had a romantic relationship with a minor while paying women to pretend he had a perfect life in front of the cameras. But they all have something in common. They weren't just any drivers, they were all world champions. And together, they have more than 25 world championships. This isn't a ranking of talent. It's a ranking of scandals, decisions, fights, and choices that changed the sport forever. These are the 15 most controversial drivers in the history of Formula One, and stay until the end, because the first place was caught having sex in his team's garage right before racing in, the event that would decide his world championship. And even so, that wasn't the worst thing he did. This is the third part of this ranking, so if you want to see all the positions, I'll leave the link to the full video in the description. 7-time world champion and one of the most successful drivers in history. But on his way to the top, he also accumulated scandals, controversies, and highly debated decisions, both on and off the track. Hamilton arrived in 2007 as Fernando Alonso McLaren's teammate. And from the very first race, he fought on equal terms with the reigning 2-time world champion. And what seemed like a sporting rivalry turned into an all-out war. The tensions within the team exploded quickly. Hamilton became the favorite of McLaren, the press, and the paddock. Meanwhile, Alonso, sidelined, ended up at odds with his own team. And in the middle of all that, the Spygate scandal exploded. McLaren was accused of possessing confidential information from Ferrari, blueprints, technical data, and strategies leaked by an engineer who worked in Maranello. The investigation was intense. Hamilton's testimony before the International Automobile Federation provided key information that confirmed the crime, and thanks to his cooperation, he avoided being sanctioned. But McLaren wasn't so lucky. The International Automobile Federation imposed a $100 million fine and excluded them from the Constructors' Championship, one of the harshest penalties in the history of Formula One. Years later, Hamilton experienced another internal war, this time at Mercedes. He and Nico Rosberg were teammates, but they had known each other since they were kids. They had shared junior categories, hotels, cars, and for a long time they were best friends. But living together at Mercedes destroyed everything. In 2016, the crash between them at the Spanish Grand Prix was a point of no return. Rosberg won the title that year and retired at the end of the season, saying he couldn't stand the level of pressure and tension anymore. He preferred to retire rather than continue being Hamilton's teammate. But this wasn't the last controversial episode for the Briton on track. In 2009 in Australia, he overtook Giorno Trulli under the safety car. Seeing this, McLaren ordered him to give the position back. And he did. But later, when the stewards asked him if he let the Italian pass, Hamilton deliberately lied and said that Trulli had overtaken him illegally. The International Automobile Federation discovered the truth and disqualified him from the race. On the other hand, off the track, criticism was also frequent. In 2005, during the podium ceremony at the Chinese Grand Prix, he sprayed champagne in the face of Liu Zijin, a protocol model. Although she downplayed it, feminist organizations in the United Kingdom and China criticized him harshly. Hamilton had to apologize publicly. 2 years later at Christmas in 2017, he posted a video making fun of his nephew, who was wearing a princess costume.
Boys don't dress like princesses!
The video sparked a wave of backlash, and once again, Hamilton had to come out and apologize and delete the content. That same year, he was also criticized by people for the ethical treatment of animals after posting photos and stories on his social media petting captive tigers during a vacation in Mexico. The images were taken at the Black Jaguar White Tiger Foundation, an organization that was later reported for animal abuse. A few years later, in 2020, he became the most visible voice of the We Race as One movement within Formula One. He publicly supported Black Lives Matter after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and led protests within the paddock with shirts, messages, and gestures during the anthems. And although many applauded him, he also received criticism from former drivers, journalists, and executives who preferred to keep sports separate from politics. And the following year, the biggest battle of his career, Hamilton versus Verstappen. A battle I already talked about when I spoke about Max, but one that also marked a turning point for the Brit. With tactics, crashes, constant tension, and a season finale that is still being debated today.
This is manipulating, man.
Lewis Hamilton has won it all, but his story wasn't just full of victories. It was also full of controversies. He was a world champion. He was the idol of an entire country, but he was also at the center of two of the biggest scandals in the history of the sport. Fernando Alonso has had confrontations with rivals, teammates, teams, engine suppliers, and even with his own bosses. And always without a filter. In 2006, while fighting for the title with Michael Schumacher, Alonso did something unthinkable. He publicly attacked his own team. He claimed that within Renault there were people who didn't want him to win the championship, and that they only cared about the constructor's title. It was a bombshell and a preview of everything that would come later. Then, in 2007, he arrived at McLaren and the tension exploded from the very beginning. He shared the team with a British rookie who quickly challenged him, Lewis Hamilton. Alonso felt that McLaren was betraying him, that they favored the rookie and wanted him out. The situation became unsustainable in Hungary, where during qualifying, he deliberately blocked the Brit by staying stopped in the pits.
What's happening? They waved the flag, but he's still there.
So he didn't have time to do another fast lap to fight for pole position. The team took first and second in qualifying with Alonso on pole, but internally, it was the worst defeat of the year. That incident was one of the triggers for the scandal that would come later. Spygate, which I already talked about when I mentioned Hamilton. McLaren was accused of spying on Ferrari, and Alonso ended up handing over emails as evidence, pressured by the International Automobile Federation, which threatened to revoke his super license if he didn't cooperate. In 2008, after all this scandal and a conflicted ending with McLaren, he returned to Renault. There, just a year after the Spygate scandal, he was part of Crashgate, which I already talked about in the segment about Nelson Piquet Jr. But something I didn't mention is that, according to multiple sources, Alonso knew about the plan. That way, he won the Singapore race thanks to his teammate's intentional crash. And even though he wasn't penalized, his image was marked forever. Then, Ferrari came. And with Ferrari, another controversial chapter. That year, team orders were forbidden. But at the 2010 German Grand Prix, the team asked Felipe Massa to let Alonso pass. They tried to cover it up, but it went terribly. And that's where one of the most iconic phrases in the history of the category was born.
Okay, so Fernando is faster than you.
Ferrari was fined $100,000 for this. And going back to the topic of Alonso's statements, these were not only against his teams, like Renault or McLaren, but also against his rivals. In 2012, while fighting for the championship with Sebastian Vettel, he made another explosive statement.
Right now, we're not fighting against Vettel. We fought against Vettel when we all had more or less the same car throughout the championship. Up to that point, we were leading the championship. Now we're fighting against Adrian Newey, right? And for now, we can't beat him.
At Ferrari, this went down terribly. But if his time at Ferrari didn't turn out as he expected, his frustration reached another level in the McLaren-Honda era. This partnership made Alonso add another victim to his list: the engine manufacturers. In 2015, after several mechanical failures and disastrous performance, he exploded over the radio with a phrase that went down in history.
GP2 engine. GP2?
A way of saying that the Honda engine was so bad, it seemed like it belonged to a lower category. What's more, that same year, after retiring from qualifying in Brazil due to another car failure, he got out and went to sunbathe against the wall. Literally. At Alpine, he was involved in several incidents with Esteban Ocon, as I mentioned in the section about the Frenchman. They had on-track battles that created tension within the team and ended with the Spaniard leaving the project. Fernando Alonso has been one of the most talented drivers of his generation, but also one of the most controversial and problematic. Starring in two of the biggest scandals in Formula One history. He was a world champion, an idol for an entire country, and an eternal legend of the sport. But not only that, he also had a relationship with a minor, ended up in a fist fight with a rookie driver, and was involved in some of the biggest political scandals Formula One has ever seen. Ayrton Senna was the most admired driver of his generation, and at the same time, one of the most controversial. In Brazil, he had a relationship for years with Adriana Yamin, the daughter of a family friend. The problem, he was 24 and she was only 15. Both of them kept it hidden for a long time, and, according to what she said later, they lived under the supervision of both sets of parents, and only had sexual relations when she turned 18. And while this was happening in secret, Senna was facing rumors about his sexuality. Nelson Piquet started to publicly say that Senna was homosexual. To silence the rumors, his father hired models to accompany Ayrton to public events. And even though the accusation wasn't true, the controversy escalated so much that Piquet ended up being forced to retract his statement in court. Also on the track, his character was already causing conflicts from the very beginning. In 1984, with just a few races in Formula One, Senna made history in the rain at Monaco. He started from 13th place, but in the middle of a storm, he overtook everyone, including Alain Prost. He passed him on the track, but just seconds before, Jean-Marie Balestre, president of the International Automobile Sports Federation, waved the red flag. The result was taken based on the order of the previous lap, and so Prost kept first place. At that moment, Balestre became his first enemy. In response to this, Senna said the following:
Formula One is political, there's a lot of money involved.
Years later, in 1989, Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost were teammates at McLaren. The relationship was tense but respectful, until at Imola, Senna broke an internal agreement. They had agreed not to attack each other in the first corner if they were in first and second position, but Senna ignored it and overtook him. Then he justified himself by saying that the agreement didn't apply after a restart. From that moment, the relationship was broken forever. At year's end, both arrived at Suzuka to decide the championship. Senna started from pole and Prost from second place, but on the clean side, so the Frenchman had the advantage and took the lead. After Prost led the entire race with just a few laps to go, Senna tried to overtake him at the chicane. The Frenchman closed the door and the inevitable happened. Prost retired. For his part, Senna asked for help from the marshals, got back on track, changed the front wing, and came back to win the race. It seemed like a feat that gave him a shot at the championship. Until, after the race, the International Automobile Sports Federation disqualified him for cutting the chicane, a decision made directly by Jean-Marie Balestre, a close friend of Prost. McLaren appealed, but the International Automobile Sports Federation dismissed the evidence, stating Senna's track record warranted the penalty. In addition, the Brazilian was fined $100,000 and given a 6-month suspension. In response, he said the following:
They treated me like a criminal.
And revenge came a year later. Senna arrived at Suzuka in 1990 with a 9-point lead and only needed Prost not to win. He qualified first, but the International Automobile Sports Federation again forced him to start on the dirty side. But Senna had made up his mind from the start. He wasn't going to let them steal a world title from him again. Prost had a better start, and Senna, without braking, crashed into him at the first corner. Both were out of the race, and with that, Ayrton secured his second world title. And after denying it for a whole year at the end of 1991, he publicly confessed that the crash was deliberate. Another of his happiest but controversial moments was in 1993. During the Japanese Grand Prix, Eddie Irvine, a rookie, aggressively unlapped himself, as I mentioned before. This was a situation that the Brazilian found disrespectful and unnecessary. Hours later, he went to the Jordan motorhome, argued with Irvine, and when the rookie told him he didn't need to ask for permission to race, Senna lost his patience and punched him in the face. The incident was reported. Senna had to testify before the authorities and received a 2-race suspension, which was replaced by a 6-month conditional sanction. Ayrton Senna was an idol for an entire country and a 3-time world champion. But he was also involved in scandals, betrayals, and assaults. And although his talent was unquestionable, his legacy still divides opinions to this day. He was a 7-time world champion, but also one of the dirtiest drivers to ever set foot on a Formula One track. Michael Schumacher not only won with talent, he also did it with cheating, controversies, and scandals that marked his career. In 1994, his team Benetton was accused of using illegal traction control software that gave him a clear advantage over the rest. The International Automobile Federation couldn't prove it, but they did find them guilty of using a modified fuel valve, which allowed them to refuel 12.5% faster than their rivals. But the car wasn't the only problem. At Silverstone that same year, Schumacher made an overtake on the formation lap, which is forbidden. And when he was shown the black flag, he decided to ignore it for 5 laps. The consequence, a 2-race suspension, but that was nothing compared to what would come next. In the last race of the championship that year, he arrived in first place with a 1-point lead over Damon Hill. Schumacher led the entire race until, on lap 36, he went off the track, hit the wall, and damaged his car. When he saw this, Hill tried to overtake him, but Schumacher intentionally crashed into him at the next corner. Both of them retired from the race, and the German was crowned world champion for the first time. A dirty move, but an effective one, so much so that 3 years later he tried it again. In 1997 in Jerez, he arrived tied in points with Jacques Villeneuve. On lap 48, the Canadian tried to overtake him and Schumacher repeated the tactic, crashing into him to take him out. But this time, he failed. The Ferrari was destroyed and Schumacher had to retire. Villeneuve, despite the impact, managed to continue and cross the finish line in 3rd place, which was enough for him to become world champion. The tactic was so blatant that the International Automobile Federation disqualified him, not just from the race, from the entire championship. Schumacher didn't lose his victories, but in the official records, his name doesn't even appear as runner-up. A few years later, he took his aggressions off the track. At the 1998 Belgian Grand Prix, he was leading in the rain and fighting for the title against Mika Hakkinen, David Coulthard's teammate. When he tried to lap the Scotsman, Coulthard suddenly slowed down. The German didn't see him and crashed into him at over 200 kilometers per hour.
Oh my God! Michael Schumacher hits David Coulthard and he's out!
The Ferrari was destroyed. Schumacher, furious, got out of the car and went straight to the McLaren garage to look for Coulthard. He wanted to get into a fight, but the mechanic stopped him. However, his worst conflicts were not with his rivals, but within his own team. In 1999, Eddie Irvine was fighting for the Drivers' Championship for Ferrari while Schumacher was coming back from an injury. Instead of helping him, he conspired with John Todd not to give him full technical support. Schumacher didn't want another driver to win the title with his team, even if that meant Ferrari would lose another championship. And with Rubens Barrichello, the submission was total. In Austria in 2002, the Brazilian was comfortably leading, but in the last corner on team orders, he braked to let Schumacher pass. The booing was historic and Ferrari was fined $1 million. The podium was so embarrassing that even Schumacher himself didn't know where to stand. But if we're talking about dirty moves, the one he pulled in Monaco 2006 was one of the worst. Schumacher was battling Fernando Alonso for pole position. The Spaniard was in 2nd place, but he was on a fast lap and everything indicated that if he finished it, he would get ahead of Schumacher. And just as Alonso was about to finish his fast lap, the German lost control and left his car blocking the track. The yellow flag ruined the times of everyone still on a lap. His excuse, that he had made a mistake. But if things stayed that way, Schumacher would keep pole position. The International Automobile Federation didn't believe him and put him last on the grid. Michael Schumacher was one of the most successful drivers in history, but also one of the most dishonest that Formula One has ever had. And before we get to the last spot, if you've made it this far, you're probably enjoying the video, so subscribe. He was a world champion, the biggest Playboy to ever set foot in a paddock, and the most controversial on this list, remembered as the man who slept with 5,000 women. James Hunt was many things, but discreet was not one of them. In his early days, he was nicknamed Hunt the Shunt because of his tendency to crash. And although his talent was undeniable, it was his lifestyle that made him a legend. He had a ritual that even surprised his mechanics, having sex before qualifying sessions or races. According to him, it helped him relax. In addition, it was common to see him smoking in the paddock, even while wearing the team uniform. And in 1976, the year he became world champion, He took his habits to the extreme. Before the showdown in Japan against Niki Lauda, Hunt went through a sexual marathon in Tokyo with dozens of women. And then he was caught by the mechanics having sex in the McLaren garage. He won the title, and as if that wasn't enough, he celebrated with a photo shoot surrounded by two completely naked women. The images, published by a British magazine, were censored in several countries. But for him, it was just another example of his philosophy: living without limits. But it wasn't all partying. Sometimes his temper would get the better of him. At the 1977 Canadian Grand Prix, he had an accident with his teammate Jochen Mass. And when one of the marshals came over to help him, Hunt lost control and punched him. He was given the highest fine of the time, $2,000 plus a penalty for returning to the pits in an unsafe manner. On the other hand, his lack of concern for emotional ties was also part of his legend. It was to such an extent that when the actor Richard Burton offered him $1 million to divorce his wife Susie Miller without making any trouble, Hunt gladly accepted. Besides being a womanizer, he smoked, drank, and used marijuana habitually and excessively. In 1979, according to his second wife, Sarah Lomax, he fled from the police in Scotland because he had a considerable amount of weed in the car and didn't want to get caught. After retiring, his lifestyle didn't change. As a commentator for the British Broadcasting Corporation, his broadcasts were full of sexist, biting, and politically incorrect remarks.
Mansell goes on the inside. He should know he's there. He's leading the race, and look at this idiot. For starters, he has the mental age of 10. And all I can say to that is shh.
Many loved him, others not so much, but everyone remembered him because James Hunt didn't know how to go unnoticed either inside or outside a car. If you want to see the full ranking with the previous 10 spots that aren't included here, watch this video. You'll discover the rest of the 15 most controversial drivers in Formula One history. I'll also leave the link in the description.